Right, after looking over one of my old vids, I thought I'd do a little bit of a remake.
Remake? Oh.
Just to clarify a few things and make things a little easier to understand, and to get rid of some of the cuts that were just absolutely atrocious. The video I'm remaking that this is basically it's a remake of the Science Delusion, or also known as Why Science is a Dogmatic Bitch. This first guy, it's going to be this is going to be a series of clips from certain lectures that I found rather enlightening, shall we say. They'll feature material from people like Russell Targs, Rupert Sheldrake, amongst others. Anyway, it's going to start off with Rupert Sheldrake's TEDx lecture, which was banned, actually. A banned TEDx lecture. To this day, I don't know why it was banned. You'll have to watch it. By Rupert Sheldrake, on his book, The Science Delusion, where he goes into the different, what he sees as dogmas of materialistic science today, and then uses a scientific method to completely discredit, debunk and disprove them. It's genius. But as a little sort of as a little bit of an aid to what he's going on about, or maybe chiming in every now and again just to give you an idea of what he means. Okay, I'll see you at the other end of this video. Okay, see you in a minute.
The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very widespread belief in our society. It's the kind of belief system of people who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. It's a belief system which has now been spread to the entire world. But there's a conflict in the heart of science between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or a worldview. And unfortunately, the worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the very lifeblood of the scientific endeavor. Since the late 19th century, science has been conducted under the aspect of a belief system or worldview, which is essentially that of materialism, philosophical materialism. And the sciences are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the materialist worldview. I think that as we break out of it, the sciences will be regenerated. What I do in my book, The Science Delusion, which is called Science Set Free in the United States, is take the 10 dogmas or assumptions of science and turn them into questions, seeing how well they stand up if you look at them scientifically. None of them stand up very well. What I'm going to do is first run through what these 10 dogmas are, and then I'll only have time to discuss one or two of them in a bit more detail. But essentially the 10 dogmas, which are the default worldview of most educated people all over the world, are first that nature is mechanical or machine-like. The universe is like a machine, animals and plants are like machines, we're like machines. In fact, we are machines. We're lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, with brains that are genetically programmed computers. Second, matter is unconscious. The whole universe is made up of unconscious matter. There's no consciousness in stars, in galaxies, in planets, in animals, in plants, and there ought not to be any in us either, if this theory is true. So a lot of the philosophy of mind over the last 100 years is trying to prove that we're not really conscious at all. So the matter's unconscious, then the laws of nature are fixed. This is dogma 3. The laws of nature are the same now as they were at the time of the Big Bang, and they'll be the same forever. Not just the laws, but the constants of nature are fixed, which is why they are called constants. Dogma 4, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. It never changes in total quantity, except at the moment of the Big Bang, when it all sprang into existence from nowhere in a single instant. The fifth dogma is that nature is purposeless. There are no purposes in all nature, and the evolutionary process has no purpose or direction. Dogma 6, biological heredity is material. Everything you inherit is in your genes, or in epigenetic modifications of the genes, or in cytoplasmic inheritance. It's material. Dogma 7, memories are stored inside your brain as material traces. Somehow everything you remember is in your brain in modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins. No one knows how it works, but nevertheless, almost everyone in the scientific world believes it must be in the brain. Dogma 8, your mind is inside your head. All your consciousness is the activity of your brain and nothing more. Dogma 9, which follows from Dogma 8, psychic phenomena like telepathy are impossible. Your thoughts and intentions cannot have any effect at a distance because your mind's inside your head. Therefore, all the apparent evidence for telepathy and other psychic phenomena is illusory. People believe these things happen, but it's just because they don't know enough about statistics, or they're deceived by coincidences, or it's wishful thinking.
Pardon? What was that? Okay, well, I think this guy may have something to say about that. Russell, do you mind taking over for a minute? Thank you.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. My name is Russell Targ, and I'm a physicist. And it's my great pleasure to tell you about the remarkable work we did at Stanford Research Institute investigating psychic abilities. We did that for the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, NASA, and many, many other intelligence agencies, part of the U.S. government intelligence system.
So let's just go over that again, shall we? We've just been told something off nice little Russell Targs, and now what Rupert has just told us about the belief of mainstream science at the moment. Can we just go over that once again, Rupert, please? And Russell, thank you.
Dogma 9, which follows from Dogma 8, psychic phenomena like telepathy are impossible. Your thoughts and intentions cannot have any effect at a distance because your mind's inside your head. Therefore, all the apparent evidence for telepathy and other psychic phenomena is illusory. People believe these things happen, but it's just because they don't know enough about statistics, or they're deceived by coincidences, or it's wishful thinking.
So I did hear that right. Right, yeah, okay. Right, well, okay, there's not just Russell Targs that's investigated consciousness. There's also a guy called Claude Swanson that has gone into so much to do with paranormal science. It's unbelievable. And subtle energies. He's part of the Monroe Institute, along with another bloke that's in this list, who is called Tom Campbell. That is another absolute genius, consciousness scientist, out-of-body experiencer, you name it, he's done it. Also we have Nassim Harreman, who is a quantum physicist, and now that Stephen Hawking's no longer with us, in fact even when Stephen Hawking was with us, he was still, and probably is now, the smartest man on the planet, mark my words. And he's dyslexic, crazy shit, man. And then we have Sir Roger Penrose, again, consciousness scientist, physicist, astrophysicist, amazing book. Anything done by those, any of the lectures, I advise subscribing to their YouTube channels and checking them all out. I will put information about them all and their bios in the description below. Anyway, back to Rupert.
And Dogma 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. That's why governments only fund research into mechanistic medicine and ignore complementary and alternative therapies. Those can't possibly really work because they're not mechanistic. They may appear to work because people would have got better anyway, or because of the placebo effect. But the only kind that really works is mechanistic medicine.
Okay. Right, this, what I'm going to show you in a minute is a TED Talk from 2011 by a guy whose name completely escapes me right at this precise second. But he found a cure for cancer using sound and resonance. Something that materialistic science says is impossible. Don't believe me? Have a look.
Here is my little frequency control box. So first we attack pancreatic cancer. Take a good look at this slide, because the next one will look quite different. After we treat these cells, they change their shape and size, and they begin to grow long, rope-like structures out the sides. They look something like antennas. I call them bioantennas for biological antennas. It's as if the cancer cells are trying to tune in to our signal. It also turns out this is the beginning of a process of destruction for cancer cells. We now know that cancer is vulnerable between the frequencies of 100,000 hertz and 300,000 hertz. So now we attack leukemia cells. Leukemia cell number 1 tries to grow a copy of itself, but the new cell is shattered into dozens of fragments and scattered across the slide. Leukemia cell number 2 then hyperinflates and also dies. Leukemia cell number 3 then tries to make another cancer cell. The new cell is shattered and the original cell dies. But killing a handful of leukemia cells is not enough for a patient. What kind of numbers can we do? In repeated controlled laboratory experiments, independently assayed by the 2 top experts, we killed an average of 25% to 42% of the leukemia cells, as high as 60%. They also determined that we slowed the growth rate of the cancer by as much as 65%, so a double effect. Now we attack ovarian cancer cells. This is a more distant shot. Here you see brackets coming up around the cells, showing groups of ovarian cancer cells which are being destroyed. You can see by the end of the video that a great many ovarian cancer cells were destroyed. Now we attack pancreatic cancer once more. In the center of the screen is a clump of pancreatic cancer cells, like a microtumor under the microscope. We turn on our electronic signals, and the tumor shrinks and is broken up. The cells are disconnecting, disaggregating, the opposite of forming a tumor. And some of the cells are destroyed. In our most recent work, we attacked the deadly organism MRSA. MRSA is particularly dangerous because it's resistant to many common antibiotics. Thousands of people die every year from MRSA. They have drugs for it, but they have very toxic side effects. We found that our electronic signals could actually eliminate antibiotic resistance in MRSA. Then by adding a very small amount of a common antibiotic, we were able to kill MRSA and slow its growth rate. Since I was a 17-year-old high school student with twin interests in both music and science, I never imagined the two would come together in a cancer research lab. I now believe that the future cancer treatment rooms for children will be a very different place. It will be a pleasant place where children gather and make new friends. They probably won't even know they're sick. They'll draw pictures, color in their books, play with their toys, all the while unaware that above them are beautiful blue, pinkish plasma lights emanating healing, pulsing electric fields, shattering their cancer painlessly and non-toxically, one cell at a time. Thank you.
Well, this is the default worldview, which is held by almost all educated people all over the world. It's the basis of the educational system, the National Health Service, the Medical Research Council, governments, and it's just the default worldview of educated people. But I think every one of these dogmas is very, very questionable. And when you look at it, they fall apart. I'm going to take first the idea that the laws of nature are fixed. This is a hangover from an older worldview before the 1960s, when the Big Bang Theory came in. People thought that the whole universe was eternal, governed by eternal mathematical laws. When the Big Bang came in, then that assumption continued, even though the Big Bang revealed a universe that's radically evolutionary, about 14 billion years old, growing and developing and evolving for 14 billion years, growing and cooling, and more structures and patterns appear within it. But the idea is all the laws of nature were completely fixed at the moment of the Big Bang, like a cosmic Napoleonic code.
Wrong again. Not doing so well here, science, are you? Okay, I've shown this before. This is sonoluminescence. Astounding, absolutely astounding. It's 2 minutes of a job. Watch this, and that just disproves that last point.
Sonoluminescence.
The first time I saw sonoluminescence was in a darkened room. I was transfixed to look at this spherical flask of fluid. And you'd look into the center, and in the center see a glowing blue-purple light, which could be seen with the unaided eye. It looked like a star in the heavens.
Seth Putterman called it the star in a jar, a tiny spot of bright light contained in a flask of liquid. This star in a jar is made when a sound wave is passed through a small bubble inside a flask of liquid. And this sound wave makes the bubble do something remarkable. First it expands, then it collapses. And this collapse happens so violently that vapor molecules trapped inside the bubble slam together and heat up so much that the bubble gives off an incredible burst of heat and light, several thousand times a second, giving the appearance of a star. What made the phenomenon so exciting was the temperature of this star in a jar. On its surface alone, the light burns at tens of thousands of degrees. And Seth Putterman now contemplated a tantalizing possibility. Could the core of the collapsing bubble be even hotter? Hot enough for fusion?
One of the mysteries of sonoluminescence is to determine exactly how hot the interior of the bubble gets. In the sun, the interior can be millions of degrees, hot enough to cause fusion. And the thought crossed my mind that perhaps inside the collapsing bubble, the interior of the bubble might also get hot enough to cause fusion.
If so, this would be something truly amazing. By simply bombarding tiny bubbles with sound waves, temperatures of over 10 million degrees would be created. And nuclear fusion, the same reaction that powers the sun, would be happening almost effortlessly here on Earth.
As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. Well, in an evolutionary universe, why shouldn't the laws themselves evolve? After all, human laws do, and the idea of laws of nature is based on a metaphor with human laws. It's a very anthropocentric metaphor. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized societies have laws. As C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's obeying a law makes it a man and even a citizen. It's a metaphor that we've got so used to, we forget it's a metaphor. In an evolving universe, I think a much better idea is the idea of habits. I think the habits of nature evolve. The regularities of nature are essentially habitual. This was an idea put forward at the beginning of the 20th century by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. And it's an idea which various other philosophers have entertained, and it's one which I myself have developed into a scientific hypothesis, the hypothesis of morphic resonance, which is the basis of these evolving habits. According to this hypothesis, everything in nature has a kind of collective memory. Resonance occurs on the basis of similarity. As a young giraffe embryo grows in its mother's womb, it tunes in to the morphic resonance of previous giraffes. It draws on that collective memory. It grows like a giraffe and it behaves like a giraffe because it's drawing on this collective memory. It has to have the right genes to make the right proteins, but genes, in my view, are grossly overrated. They only account for the proteins that the organism can make, not the shape or the form or the behavior. Every species has a kind of collective memory. Even crystals do. This theory predicts that if you make a new kind of crystal for the first time, the very first time you make it, it won't have an existing habit. But once it crystallizes, then the next time you make it, there'll be an influence from the first crystals to the second ones all over the world by morphic resonance. It'll crystallize a bit easier. The third time, there'll be an influence from the first and second crystals. There is, in fact, good evidence that new compounds get easier to crystallize all around the world, just as this theory would predict. It also predicts that if you train animals to learn a new trick, for example, rats learn a new trick in London, then all around the world, rats of the same breed should learn the same trick quicker just because the rats have learned it here. And surprisingly, there's already evidence that this actually happens. Anyway, that's my own hypothesis in a nutshell of morphic resonance. Everything depends on evolving habits, not on fixed laws. But I want to spend a few moments on the constants of nature too, because these are, again, assumed to be constant. Things like the gravitational constant, the speed of light, are called the fundamental constants. Are they really constant? Well, when I got interested in this question, I tried to find out. They're given in physics handbooks. Handbooks of physics list the existing fundamental constants, tell you their value. But I wanted to see if they'd changed. So I got the old volumes of physical handbooks. I went to the Patent Office Library here in London, and they're the only place I could find that kept the old volumes. Normally people throw them away when the new values come out. They throw away the old ones. When I did this, I found that the speed of light dropped between 1928 and 1945 by about 20 kilometers per second. It's a huge drop because they're given with errors of only fractions of decimal points of error. And yet, all over the world, it dropped, and they were all getting values very similar to each other with tiny errors. And then in 1945, it went up, 48, it went up again. And then people started getting very similar values again. I was very intrigued by this, and I couldn't make sense of it. So I went to see the head of metrology at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. Metrology is the science in which people measure constants. And I asked him about this. I said, what do you make of this drop in the speed of light between 1928 and 1945? And he said, oh dear, he said, you've uncovered the most embarrassing episode in the history of our science. So I said, well, could the speed of light have actually dropped? And that would have amazing implications if so. He said, no, of course it couldn't have actually dropped. It's a constant. So, well then how do you explain the fact everyone was finding it going much slower during that period? Is it because they were fudging their results to get what they thought other people should be getting, and the whole thing was just produced in the minds of physicists? We don't like to use the word fudge. I said, well, what do you prefer? He said, well, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. So I said, well, if it was going on then, how can we be so sure it's not going on today? And that the present values are produced by intellectual phase locking. And he said, oh, we know that's not the case. I said, how do we know? He said, we've solved the problem. And I said, well, how? He said, well, we fixed the speed of light by definition in 1972. So I said, but it might still change. He said, yes, but we'd never know it because we've defined the meter in terms of the speed of light. So the units had changed with it. So he looked very pleased about that. They'd fixed that problem. But I said, well, then what about big G? The gravitational constant, known in the trade as big G, is written with a capital G, Newton's universal gravitational constant. That's varied by more than 1.3% in recent years. And it seems to vary from place to place and from time to time. And he said, oh, well, those are just errors. And unfortunately, there are quite big errors with big G. So I said, well, what if it's really changing? I mean, perhaps it is really changing. And then I looked at how they do it. What happens is they measure it in different labs. They get different values on different days, and then they average them. And then other labs around the world do the same, and they come out usually with a rather different average. And then the International Committee on Metrology meets every 10 years or so and average the ones from labs around the world to come up with the value of big G. But what if G were actually fluctuating? What if it changed? There's already evidence, actually, that it changes throughout the day and throughout the year. What if the Earth, as it moves through the galactic environment, went through patches of dark matter or other environmental factors that could alter it? Maybe they all change together. What if these errors are going up together and down together? For more than 10 years, I've been trying to persuade metrologists to look at the raw data. In fact, I'm now trying to persuade them to put it online on the internet with the dates and the actual measurements and see if they're correlated, to see if they're all up at one time, all down at another. If so, they might be fluctuating together, and that would tell us something very, very interesting. But no one has done this. They haven't done it because G is a constant. There's no point looking for changes. You see, here's a very simple example of where a dogmatic assumption actually inhibits inquiry. I myself think that the constants may vary quite considerably, within narrow limits, but they may all be varying. And I think the day will come when scientific journals like Nature have a weekly report on the constants, like stock market reports in newspapers. You know, this week, big G was slightly up, the charge on the electron was down, the speed of light held steady, and so on. That's one area, just one area where I think thinking less dogmatically could open things up. One of the biggest areas is the nature of the mind. This is the most unsolved problem, as Graham just said, that science simply can't deal with the fact we're conscious. And it can't deal with the fact that our thoughts don't seem to be inside our brains. Our experiences don't all seem to be inside our brain. Your image of me now doesn't seem to be inside your brain, yet the official view is there's a little Rupert somewhere inside your head, and everything else in this room is inside your head. Your experience is inside your brain. I'm suggesting actually that vision involves an outward projection of images. What you're seeing is in your mind, but not inside your head. Our minds are extended beyond our brains in the simplest act of perception. I think that we project out the images we're seeing, and these images touch what we're looking at. If I look at you from behind, you don't know I'm there. Could I affect you? Could you feel my gaze? There's a great deal of evidence that people can. The sense of being stared at is an extremely common experience, and recent experimental research suggests it's real. Animals seem to have it too. I think it probably evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. Prey animals that could feel the gaze of a predator would survive better than those that couldn't. This would lead to a whole new way of thinking about ecological relationships between predators and prey, also about the extent of our minds. If we look at distant stars, I think our minds reach out in a sense to touch those stars and literally extend out over astronomical distances. They're not just inside our heads. Now, it may seem astonishing that this is a topic of debate in the 21st century. We know so little about our own minds that where our images are is a hot topic of debate within consciousness studies right now. I don't have time to deal with any more of these dogmas, but every single one of them is questionable. If one questions it, new forms of research, new possibilities open up. And I think as we question these dogmas that have held back science so long, science will undergo a reflowering, a renaissance. I'm a total believer in the importance of science. I've spent my whole life as a research scientist, my whole career. But I think by moving beyond these dogmas, it can be regenerated. Once again, it can become interesting and, I hope, life-affirming. Thank you.
Okay, now just to back up what Rupert Sheldrake has just said, here's a clip from Sonic Geometry. It's a fascinating video. I recommend anyone to watch it. I'll put a link in the description below. But here's just a brief clip of it. Okay, see you in a minute again.
That Sumerian-based geometry could be represented as audio frequencies. That if you played the sum angle total of virtually any combination of basic geometric shapes, from the 180s of triangles to the 540s of pentagons to the 2160s of cubes, you would get various arrangements of a numerically perfect major chord revealed by a factor 9 grid, which in turn is built upon a tone vibrating at 432 cycles per second. It should be noted that this key tone used to tune instruments has drifted up and down over the centuries, and that 440 cycles is the current international standard. Does this matter? For musical purposes, it could be argued that any tuning system is as good as the next, just so long as every instrument is tuned to the same tone. But since all life can be expressed as energy held together by frequency and vibration, maybe we should be looking deeper at the numerical information revealed by the factor 9 grid. It is interesting that when tuning is anything other than 432, the corresponding grid does not produce any intriguing numerical sequences. But when we revert to 432, and if we move up and down strictly by multiples of 9, an astonishing 14-tone matrix of synchronicity begins to appear. For instance, on this unique grid, we find not just some, but all of the numbers representing every primary geometric shape. Looking deeper, we see many other numbers that have played into some of humanity's most profound religious texts. The 72 names of God in the Kabbalah. There is 108, the number of times mantras and mudras have been repeated in Hindu ceremonies. We find 144, a number sequence represented in the Great Pyramid of Giza, the number of days in a Mayan Baktun, or even the 144,000 chosen ones described in the biblical book of Revelation. And of course there is 432 itself, the number mythologist Joseph Campbell encountered so many times in his cultural studies that he called it the most important mythological number in history. Standing back from this factor 9 matrix, we have to ask ourselves, how could the 432 grid not be important when it reveals so many numeric coincidences? Once again, logic stands in the way of us seeing a bigger picture. Seemingly, because any arbitrary unit of time could be used to measure vibration cycles, none should be considered any more or less correct than the other. We measure sound waves by the Sumerian second, of which there are 86,400 in a day, but we could just as easily have chosen some other span of time. And so what if the factor 9 grid reveals the numerical value of geometric shapes, the 1440 minutes in a day, the diameters of the moon and sun, and speed of light in miles? If these are all invented arbitrary measurements, a person could logically argue that these coincidental number sequences are nothing more than hand-selected data gathered to support a predetermined theory. And so we must search further. We must look for something completely non-arbitrary, a natural order or pattern of some kind that might serve to bind all this information together. But what might that be? And if it's here on this planet, why haven't we already found it? Maybe perspective has been our problem. What if the answer isn't on this planet, but is the planet itself? After all, the Earth does move in ways that reveal observable patterns. It spins at a rate we call a day, and orbits the Sun in a period known as a year. But were you aware of our globe's largest cycle? It is an extremely slow wobble that takes 25,920 years to complete. Known as the precession of the equinox, this unique phenomenon is the largest and slowest movement Earth makes. Much as we do today when we observe celestial objects, does it not stand to reason that an intelligence possessing a distant view of Earth would be aware of its signature wobble? And if this is true, might not it also be possible that this same intelligence would provide us with some kind of device, a mathematical system perhaps, that would not only offer us hints of their existence, but also of their knowledge about our planet? Let's return to the factor 9 grid. Stepping back to expand our view, we take note of these numbers with a new way of seeing. And now, with a deeper understanding of the precession of the equinox, we begin to compute. Starting with the fundamental 12s and 60s of Sumerian math, we then experiment with the geometric and sacred text number sequences revealed in the 432 matrix. 12 times 2160, 60 times 432, 360 times 72, 180 times 144. The answer to all these equations, 25,920. Like gears turning in a precisely machined clock, we see that every single one of these numbers fits perfectly into 25,920 without remainder. And what we now must realize is that we are no longer talking about an arbitrary math system, but one that can be cross-checked by a completely non-arbitrary thing, the physical wobble of our planet. What's more, we need to keep in mind that this system was implemented long before our ancestors could possibly know what it would reveal, and shared in the only way it could be shared, not by corruptible stories and myths, but in the pure realm of mathematics. In essence, it would seem that we have been catching up to significant information contained in 1260 math, slowly coming to realize that a message of sorts has been making its way across the cosmos into our collective consciousness for thousands of years. And just what is this message? In a word, it is harmony. When we play together as frequencies the numbers of all the primary geometric shapes, what presents itself is a three-tone, numerically perfect major chord. This phenomenon should not be taken lightly, for what we are seeing is a certain kind of proof that nature, as revealed by mathematical patterns, is a force existing in literal harmony with itself. To further see how harmonics are represented in the workings of creation, consider the Fibonacci sequence, which was first shared with the Western world by Leonardo Fibonacci in 1202. This numerical sequence has been found to represent the spiraling growth pattern of many organic shapes, from seashells to entire galaxies, and so represents one of the most important mathematical algorithms ever discovered. If you are at all familiar with this sequence, you know that it starts from 0, moves forward by 1, then continues by adding the previous 2 digits to arrive at the next in the sequence. So when we take our first two numbers, 0 and 1, and add them together, the sum is still 1. From here, the sequence begins its journey. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. 3 plus 2 is 5. 5 plus 3 is 8, and so on into infinity. Now, if we were to apply frequencies to this sequence, we would not get audible tones, as single-digit vibrations per second cannot be heard by the human ear. Instead, let's start the Fibonacci series with an audible sound wave. In this case, we will use the numeric value of a simple geometric shape, the triangle. With an angle sum total of 180, this is what a triangle sounds like. Now let's begin again, this time taking note of both the number and tone it represents. We start at 180, and of course 0 plus 180 gives us another 180. Next is 180 plus 180, 360, an octave above the first tone, and also the number representing the sum total of a circle or a square. And here is when things get really interesting. Add 360 to the 180 before it, and you get 540. The sum total of a pentagon, and also a perfect harmonic fifth of our first tone. Then 540 plus 360, and the total is 900. A septagon, and the major third required to build a geometrically perfect major chord once again. Moving one step higher, you get 1440, represented in geometry as a star tetrahedron, or the shape known in ancient Jewish texts as a Merkaba, and which provides another octave of our first tone.
What do you think of that, guys, eh? Right, just to finish off, here's another TED Talk, which was also banned by TED, no idea why, by Russell Targ. There's the rest of it. This is just unbelievable, absolutely astounding. Anyway, I'll leave you to it. Okay, see you later, bye.
I got into all this as a childhood magician, standing on the stage in New York doing mental magic. And I had the experience from time to time of having a direct perception of something in the life stream of the person whose mind I was pretending to read, or whose fortune I was pretending to tell. So I was not a real psychic. I was just a kid doing magic. But I've now talked to people like Kreskin and Melbourne Christopher, and they said, oh yes, every professional magician knows that from time to time you're given some material, and you can then supplement your magic trick with whatever ESP comes to you. And there are many magicians who do that, as we know. But I was not doing magic for the CIA. As we know, the CIA is not easily amused, and we were trying to do the real thing for them. The work we did at SRI involved things like finding a downed Russian airplane in North Africa with code books on it, locating a kidnapped American general in northern Italy, looking into a Soviet weapons factory in Soviet Siberia, describing the construction of a huge Soviet submarine in northern Russia, and we even looked on a Chinese atomic bomb test 3 days before it was scheduled to go off, and described correctly that it was going to fail. So we did quite a lot of useful things for the government during our 23-year program. The ability we're talking about is a natural psychic ability that we all have, in spite of what you may have heard to the contrary. People can quiet their mind and describe and experience what's happening in a distant place or in the future. And this has been talked about for thousands of years. Buddhists have a vast lore about what this is and how to do it and why it's desirable. And I'll try and talk about that later. The ability allows you to quiet your mind and describe and experience what's happening in the future. And you can do that independent of the distance. The most interesting thing that we found as physicists is that it's no harder to describe what's happening in Soviet Siberia 6,000 miles away than it is for you to describe the funny object I have in my pocket. 6,000 miles away does not decrease the accuracy or the reliability as compared with something nearby. Looking into the distance is no harder than looking at a contemporaneous event, and that's why this is called a non-local perception. not quantum mechanical particularly. It pertains to the fact that we live in a non-local space-time described as scientifically, most recently by Schrödinger in the 1920s, and then proved in the 1970s and 1980s. So the idea of non-local connections is not New Age. This is accepted in the physical community. The hottest topic in modern physics is exploring non-locality. It was described originally by the Buddhists 2,000 years ago, but modern physics has finally caught up. The leaders of the program that we had at SRI are all physicists. The physicists are taking over what used to be called parapsychology. The three leaders of the program were myself and Hal Puthoff, who are both laser physicists, and Ed May, who is a nuclear physicist. And we were eager that our scientific friends would not think that we'd gone off the rails into ESP research, so we made sure that we published everything we did, all of our experiments, in the world's most prestigious journals where we would normally publish our science. So we published our work in the Proceedings of the Institute of Electrical Engineers, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Institute of Physics, and Nature magazine. So this is not, I just want to emphasize that at the time we were doing this work, this was mainstream, written up in the New York Times, published in the premier journals in the world. And I want to give you an idea of where I was when this all began. In the 1960s, I was a hardcore laser guy. And here I'm standing in front of a 1,000-watt carbon dioxide laser at my most mavericky self. I'm trying to convince the government that I indeed had 1,000 watts coming out of this 1-meter package. And you see how we've got a little meter bar there. Government thought it's impossible because their lasers were 100 times bigger than mine. So I had 1,000 watts over something a meter long. They thought that is impossible. So it's like a reprise of what I was going to do 10 years later, trying to convince the government that some other impossible thing actually happened. So in this case, the idea is that I have a big fire brick. I'm going to drill a hole right through it and then hand the skeptical government scientists this big brick with a red-hot hole right drilled through it. And I'll ask them, do you want fries with that? And eventually they supported our program. They couldn't deny the fire brick with a hole. Today we would consider that kind of thing a paranormal object. There's no way to create a red-hot hole with a fire brick because it's not flammable. So that's what I had done. That was my career. I've been in laser. I was a laser pioneer. I was working with lasers many years before there were any lasers. So this was the outgrowth of my earliest studies in graduate school. So the question that led to my recent book, I wrote a book with a provocative subtitle, A Physicist's Proof of Psychic Abilities. And the idea is that proof is evidence so strong that you can't statistically or reasonably deny it. That's what we mean by proof. You can't prove scientific things in the laboratory the way you prove mathematical theorems. You prove things in the laboratory by piling up so much evidence that it's simply unreasonable to deny it. So here we are in our laboratory, 1973. There's Pat Price in the middle. Pat Price was one of our great, great psychics. He was police commissioner of Burbank and retired. He's playing here with an ESP teaching machine that was the basis of our first NASA program. My idea was, can you offer feedback and reinforcement and help people improve their psychic ability with a little random game where you have to guess which picture will be illuminated? The answer is yes, you can learn. And the great good news for you today is that game is now available as a free application for your iPhone. So I posted that as a little gift. It's called ESP Trainer, and you can just download it and have it on your iPhone. It'll ring a bell when you get the right answer and show you a pretty picture. So that's Pat Price. Price was an extraordinary psychic. He lived in a psychic bubble. He was an inspiration for me as to what ESP looks like in an evolved person. We were once called by the Berkeley Police Department, where Patricia Hearst was kidnapped. And they said, we're so desperate, can you help us with your ESP program? It shows how desperate they were. And Pat Price and Hal Putoff and I drove to Berkeley, and Price said, let's see your mug book. He's a no-nonsense guy, had been in lots of police stations. I want to see the picture book with all the usual suspects. He turned the page, page after page, and said, that's the guy, that's the ringleader. And he put his finger on Donald DeVries, who was indeed the ringleader. It's extraordinary. But they learned that only 2 weeks later. The police said, well, can you tell us something right now that'll help us? And Price said, would you like to know where the kidnap car is? And they said, you're kidding. He said, well, so if you drive about 50 miles north on Bayshore Free on Highway 101, the kidnap car is a white station wagon. It's on the right, parked by a diner across from two large white gas storage cylinders in the pedestrian overpass across the freeway. And one of the detectives said, well, I know where that is. That's on my way to my home in Vallejo. 20 minutes later, they had found the car, and there are still cartridges rolling around on the floor of the car. That's as close to magic as I've ever seen in my 20 years in the laboratory. And the other folks there are Bob Monroe, who wrote about journeys out of the body, how to go from remote viewing to an out-of-body experience, but that's outside our schedule for today. And I'm on the right 40 years ago, and what that shows is that if you live long enough, you get to do a lot of interesting things. So this is the first in a series of experiments we did over a course of a decade, and it's basically what convinced the CIA to give us money. That is what we played is a kind of psychic hide-and-go-seek. And all the pictures I'm going to show you are like this, so I won't reiterate. The way it works is Pat Price, or the psychic of the day, is in a shielded room, electrically shielded room with me. And Hal randomly is sent to an undisclosed location, random target picked by the lab director. He generally will go with the colonel from the Army or a lab director or a contract monitor. In this case, they went to a swimming pool complex called Rinconada Park. Price with me said, I see a water purification plant. I see a square pool 65 by 80 and a round pool 100 feet in diameter and 2 water storage tanks. That's what I see. And that's what he drew on the right. Actually, they had gone to the swimming pool complex, and when we got there for feedback after the experiment, we saw the swimming pool is really 110 feet in diameter, and the rectangular pool is 75 by 100. So viewed from 5 miles away, he had the dimensions architecturally correct to 90%. Now, he had added in these 2 water tanks, which are on the right side of the picture, which are not at the location. And it's not a water purification plant, it's a swimming pool. However, and that's a story I would tell up to about 10 years ago, when the city of Palo Alto sent us a picture book showing what the city used to be like 75 and 100 years ago. 75 years, the psychic ones know what the answer is going to be already. 75 years ago, this was a water purification plant, and the tallest thing in the city of Palo Alto were the 2 water tanks I show at the top, and Price drew at the left. So what he apparently did is move his awareness 5 miles south on Middlefield Road and describe the park where the guys were hiding, and then moved his awareness 75 years back to describe the biggest thing in the city. Off my schedule, I got to tell you, he also described a National Security Agency code facility in Virginia. And he described that, was able to read the file folders. And people wanted to know, why did you pick this to read? And he said, well, the more in psychic space, the more you hide something, the brighter it shines. So let that be warning to anybody who's having an affair. So the demonstration of ability test that we had from the CIA, John McMahon, who's head of the CIA, said to us, you guys are wasting your time looking at swimming pools and churches. We have targets that would be of national security help. can you describe a target and I'll send you the coordinates. So Price and I climbed back into our little shielded phone booth, and he said, well, I'm psychically laying on a building and a giant crane is rolling back and forth over my body. There's a huge crane. It has 8 wheels, 4 on either side of the building. And in this building, they're constructing a 60-foot steel sphere and they're welding it together. That all turned out to be entirely true. In fact, it was so true that after the steel sphere was verified, we then had a congressional investigation called by the House Intelligence Oversight Committee to see if there had been a security leak. This in the spirit of no good deed goes unpunished. But the Congress eventually said what we're doing is okay. We were supported by CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency and told to press on, and we pressed on for another 15 years. Another experiment that I'll show you because it's of particular interest to me is that Hal Puthoff then went to travel. I was the interviewer through all of these. My vision's very poor, as you probably caught on, so I don't drive. And Hal was always the outbound person, and I was a stay-at-home psychic travel agent working with the person trying to elicit a description of the distant place. So this time, Hal was on a business and pleasure trip to Colombia, South America, and each day, Price sitting with me would describe, I see a church, I see a volcano, there's a harbor, there's a market, and on day 5 he didn't show up. So in the spirit that the show must go on, I said, well, I'll describe it. I've never done a remote viewing before, but I'd interviewed countless psychics and other visitors, so I knew the moves. So I said, well, this is Russ Targ, remote viewing with Pat Price. Price isn't here. When I close my eyes, I see something that looks like an airport on an island. There's ocean at the end of the runway. There's sand and grass on the right. There's an airport building on the left. That's what I get. And that's where he was. He was on an island airport off the coast of Colombia called San Andreas. My great coincidence of the day, as I was driving here, I was talking to the cab driver. He was from San Andreas and gave me a color photograph of the airport on the island. How's that for? This is my lucky day. I don't claim that's ESP. That's what you call a lucky day. I finally escaped from the laboratory and got to travel across country, and 2 other people were psychically tracking me. The first place I went was New Orleans, and no one knew, of course, where I was, and I chose my target by throwing a die on the pavement. And the die sent me to the New Orleans Superdome. So I was standing in front of the Superdome recording my coordinates. This is noon. This is Russell Targ. I'm standing in front of the Superdome. It looks like a flying saucer shining in the sun. Bad thing to say. Back in the laboratory, my friend, another physicist, Gary Langford, very psychic, straight-up physicist, was working with Elizabeth Rauscher, who interviewed him. She's another physicist. All these people are professional physicists interested in psychic stuff. Gary said, well, I have a clear picture of a circular building. It looks like a giant UFO. Do you think Russell's been abducted? So Elizabeth said, just tell me what you see, make a drawing. And of course, his drawing was a remarkably accurate. This was his also first remote viewing. Gary just came in and said, well, I've been doing this all my life, avocationally. That's how I was an analyst, photo analyst, looking at specks of buildings and describing what's inside. So he was experienced to look at fuzzy images, but here we just took away the image, but it didn't interfere with his ability at all. Our great pleasure was then to have this Army intelligence ask us to train, to set up a psychic Army Corps, something like in the Men Who Stare at Goats, but not quite. No goats were killed in our program. But we chose 6 Army officers to work with us from a big group that we interviewed, Hal and I interviewed. One of those was Joe McMoneagle, who Joe is still alive and is probably the greatest living psychic today, prodigious psychic. And his first trial, sitting with me, what's this remote viewing stuff? All of these people are basically tough Army officers, showed up in their boots and leather jackets and their patches and their backpacks. What's this psychic stuff? What do you want me to do? Betting their careers that this is a new, interesting juncture for them. So I described remote viewing, as I always do. I've been doing workshops now for 20 years. My ritual, the shibboleth, is close your eyes, quiet your mind, and describe the surprising pictures that appear in your awareness. Don't try and name it. Don't try and guess. Just describe the surprising images. And that language was understood 1,200 years ago and appears in Patanjali's guide, Self-Liberation for Seeing with Naked Awareness. If you want to move from suffering and conditioned awareness to freedom and naked awareness, sit down and shut up and quiet your mind, stop naming, stop guessing, and you're on your way. So that's what I'm still telling people following the 1,200-year-old guidebook. As an author, it's very nice for me to see a book still in print 1,200 years later. It gives me courage that my books will be around. So Joe drew this picture. He said he and his colonel went with Hal Puthoff. And Joe said, I see a building with stripes in front and a long portion behind, and a little fountain. He drew what was there, and of course the judges had no problem matching that. With our 6 Army officers, that I'll describe later, there's 6 people who had never done this before. I had them each do 6 trials a week, and we had each one, so we had 30 for 6 weeks, so we had 36 trials. You'd expect them to get 6 first-place matches by chance. We got 19 first-place matches, and they set up the Psychic Army Corps and ran another 15 years. They had 30 people on the East Coast working in tandem with the SRI group. So this is Hella Hamid, the funny story with her. Hella's my dear friend for 2 decades before the SRI program. And they said, well, Pat Price is a fantastic psychic. Ingo Swann is the one who taught us how to do remote viewing. We want to see what a control person is. CIA said, what does an ordinary person do? Well, Hella's not exactly ordinary. She's a woman of the world, speaks many languages, professional photographer, but she thought it would be very amusing to be hired as a psychic of the various things that she had done in her life. So she came to work with us. The bottom line is she became the most proficient and most reliable person in the program for the decade, our control subject. Her first trial with me, as you catch on now, we're sitting in a shielded room. Hella says, when I close my eyes, what comes into my view is squares within squares within squares. That's what Hal Puthoff sees, and he was at a pedestrian overpass. Hella's 9 trials were even more significant than Pat Price's 9 trials. In Price's, the judge guessed 7 of them first place match. What that means is that if Hal Puthoff had been kidnapped 9 times in a row, Price would have found him 7 out of the 9 times the first place he looked. Very remarkable. So here's Hella Hamid and Ingo Swann. Ingo taught us all how to do remote viewing. The way it worked is that Ingo taught Hal and me how to do remote viewing. Hal and I taught the 6 Army officers. The Army officers taught the world. So if you look at Google right now, we're still up on Google, and search for remote viewing, you'll find more than 2 million pages dealing with remote viewing, operational things to do with remote viewing. 2 million pages is quite a lot of pages for something that many people don't think exists. So at the end of the decade, reason for showing this is people get better in remote viewing. There's no decline effect. So at the end of the decade, we're still doing experiments with Hella, who is a kind of technophobe. She can change the batteries in her light meter, but she's a non-technical person. She finds physicists very amusing in their unworldly ways. But in this experiment, we gave her the coordinates for this in binary form. Someone was concerned that maybe she had memorized the globe. So we gave her the coordinates 1001110 west, 11 something north. She said, well, that's a pretty pattern. What comes to mind is a belly button shaped energy expander. This is your photographer, your artist, belly button. The target is the Berkeley Bevatron, which is indeed an energy expander. And she drew this middle drawing with the 4 beam tubes coming out of it, going to a target building, and the belly button shape is the Bevatron. And the picture from the laboratory is shown on the left. Now, I'd been looking at this picture for a decade, and it occurred to me as I'm writing my current book that my opinion, see, everything I told you up to now is true. My opinion on this picture is that she wasn't actually looking at the site, which is a big mass of concrete and steel, but she was looking 10 minutes ahead at her feedback picture, because her drawing is anomalously accurate to the picture that we showed her at a later time. So she was really cheating here. She wasn't looking at the Berkeley Bevatron. Instead, she just looked ahead a few minutes to see what we were going to show her for feedback. And in that process, she said, this is such a complicated thing. I can't grasp it. I want to make it out of clay. So this is her clay model of the Bevatron with the hole in it, with a circular particle beam, 4 beam tubes in the target building, 50 miles to the north. She absolutely had never seen a Bevatron before. And of course, the people interviewing her had no idea what the target was. So how do we evaluate these things? The effect size is a measure of the power of the experiment you're doing, not necessarily the statistical significance. You can inflate your statistics by doing millions and millions of trials. The effect size takes out the fact that you've done millions of trials and says, how powerful is this experiment? So the idea of proof is that when the government was doing tests, the NIH was doing tests to see if aspirin helped men avoid heart attacks, they did this experiment, and eventually the thing had such a large effect size, they stopped the experiment because they didn't want to deprive the poor controls of the benefit of the aspirin. Got it? The effect size was so high, they stopped the experiment. The effect size got all the way up to 0.06. And here's the NIH report where the effect size is 0.06 standard deviations. All of our experiments exceed that by a factor of 10. So if the NIH thinks that this is my little argument for proof, if the NIH thinks that they have proven that all of you should be taking aspirin and the experiment is so strong you got to stop it and give aspirin to the poor controls, that's what they mean by proof. Stop the experiment, it's proven. Our effect size is 10 times what they had. So in our experiments we did with Pat Price, were significant at odds of almost 1 in a million, more than 1 in 100,000. His effect size was more than 10 times the NIH. So this by itself is an experiment more than 1 in 100,000. In Hella Hammond's experiments, it was even more significant than Pat Price's experiments, even though she was a control subject. The Army people, which is sort of my pride and joy, in that we just brought in 6 guys, taught them to do remote viewing, and they did astonishingly well. Effect size, again, 10 times the aspirin experiment. And it was working with the Army people that led me on a career of doing workshopping for the past decade, traveling around, just teaching people to do remote viewing. On Google, you will find many, many people teaching you to do remote viewing. They all can teach you to do remote viewing. Remote viewing is easy to do. I have a chapter in my book where it describes if you work with a friend, you can quickly both become psychic. Remote viewing is a natural ability. You don't have to eat porridge at the feet of your guru or pay anybody thousands of dollars. This is a natural ability like vision or hearing. Psychic abilities are not sacred. They're abilities. They allow you to experience all kinds of remarkable things. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But here are all these guys, highly psychic. At the end of our program, right after I left, I formed a little organization called Delphi Associates, We were using remote viewing to forecast silver futures, working with an experienced remote viewer. We did 9 forecasts, whether silver is going to go up a little, up a lot, down a little, down a lot. All 9 forecasts were correct. We made $120,000, which is a lot of money in the 1980s. And we're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, BBC Horizon, Nova made a film about us. In the 1980s, ESP still existed. And there are now many, many organizations and groups of people using this associative remote viewing, which is invented by my friend Stephen Schwartz. It's a way of, even though you can't read psychically, it's a way of making substitute items for what you want to know. I can't explain that. You have to read my book, has a chapter on associative remote viewing, which is an easy guide to investing in the market. You do not have to give away your mind to be psychic. That's not required. You can be discerning and be psychic. I recommend that. So you have to decide now. I've given you a sample of what we did during the first decade of SRI. We did experiments for the government. We did operational things, finding all sorts of, even looked in on the American hostages in Iran, and described that one was going to be evacuated because of illness. So you have to decide, is the statistical evidence from our experiments at SRI strong enough to make you think that something like ESP really exists? Or do you think it was just our lucky day and we were successful in fooling the American intelligence establishment for 23 years and lived to tell the tale? So you get to decide which of those is more likely. Now, you can use remote viewing these days to find your car keys. We just had an example of using remote viewing and not finding the car keys, and that happens also. Or you can find a parking place, even in Los Angeles, and we were exemplary successful doing that yesterday. So you can find your car keys, find a parking place, you can make money in the stock market, and my opinion is that the most important thing you can do with remote viewing is discover who you are. Now, it's important for me to tell you that remote viewing is not a spiritual path. But if you learn to quiet your mind and move your awareness into timeless awareness, you are likely to begin to experience things that surprise you, give you another view of reality. For example, if you look in the mirror in the morning and think that who you see in that mirror is who you really are, you're in for a lot of suffering, in my experience. My opinion is that who you really are is non-local awareness, independent of space and time. You are that awareness that allows you to move your experience, to move your consciousness, to move your perception anywhere in the world, independent of space and time. And this was described in great detail, as I mentioned, by the great Buddhist teacher Padmasambhava in the 8th century, where he said, you have to give up your desire to name things and grasp onto them and guess what they are, because in the universe it's really empty of names, as you may have noticed. But you can give up your desire to defend your ego and what it says on your business card in conditioned awareness. And if you think that you may not be made entirely of meat and potatoes, then you can move your awareness into naked awareness, experience the universe as it is, and find a transcendent way to experience the world. And my invitation for you is to explore this transcendent place, and then as a scientist next year you can come back and tell us what you experienced. Okay, thank you.
And that's that. Absolutely fascinating, eh? Right, well, that was just a brief sort of aside, a brief hour or so. But like I said, it's a remake. I watched the old version of it. I'll still leave the old version on here, but it was just awful. But it was my first video done on a mobile phone, edited on a mobile phone. Pretty darn good, considering it was, like I said, first one. Anyway, okay. Hopefully this one will be better. All right, and I'll see you next time. One thing I did forget to say at the end of my last Ancient Man video. I seriously advise you look into, well, you watch a video by a guy called, by a channel called the Corbett Report, and it's called How Big Oil Took Over the World. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But he goes into much of what I said about how these organisations actually took over the education system. I advise watching that, because the next episode will be moving on and moving up through time, through the Sumerian age, up to the Nazi age and beyond. And then we'll start getting into how it all links together and how it all pertains to the Legion Saga novels. Anyway, I'll see you later, okay? Thanks for watching. Don't forget, like, subscribe, share these videos, for God's sake. Please share them. Please share them. I don't mind if you share them. Anyway, I'll see you later, okay? Bye-bye.